I watched a man with a doctorate in quantum physics stutter trying to read "The cat was on the roof." 7 simple words. A 7-year-old child would read them without thinking. But Dr. Benjamin Hartwell, 3 PhDs from Harvard, MIT, and Stanford, one of the brightest minds in quantum physics this country has ever produced, would freeze, sweat, tremble. Every word was a battle. I was the butler for the Hartwell family. 12 years serving that house in Manhattan. I've seen many things that money does to people, but I had never seen anything like that. How was it possible? How could someone who mastered quantum mechanics, who understood equations that looked like abstract art to the rest of us, be so broken? Jonathan Hartwell, his father, spent $500,000 trying to fix it. The best speech therapists in New York, specialized therapists, hypnotherapy, neurologists who charged more per hour than I earned in a month. 3 years. Dozens of specialists. Nothing worked. In the university hallways, I heard the whispers. I saw the looks. They had a nickname for him, Dr. Stutter. Until the night of March 1987, when James Washington, the black janitor who cleaned the university bathrooms for $12 an hour, found Benjamin alone in the locker room, destroyed after yet another disastrous presentation. James didn't offer techniques, didn't suggest exercises. He asked a question. A single question that no one had asked in 20 years. And what came out of that conversation, the truth about a 7-year-old boy, a cruel teacher, and a moment of humiliation so deep it silenced his voice for 2 decades, was just the beginning. Because 3 weeks later, I was there, in the open field of the university, on a rainy April afternoon, when Benjamin released a scream that echoed across the entire campus, the scream that set him free. What James didn't cost $500,000. It cost compassion. It cost listening. It cost seeing what all the specialists in the world could never see. That sometimes what breaks us doesn't need money to be healed. It only needs someone to ask the right question. My name doesn't matter. What matters is that I've spent 40 years serving the wealthy. I am the billionaire butler. I've stood in corners of rooms where fortunes were made and lost. I've watched empires rise and crumble. I've seen what money can buy, and more importantly, what it cannot. This story, the story of Benjamin Hartwell and James Washington, taught me something I carried with me every day since that rainy afternoon in April of 1987. It taught me that the most expensive education in the world cannot teach you what a $12 an hour janitor learned through living. That wisdom doesn't come with a price tag. That healing, real healing, begins not with a prescription or a technique, but with a single question asked with genuine care. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to where it all began. It was the winter of 1984 when I first met Dr. Benjamin Hartwell, though everyone just called him Benjamin then. He was 25 years old and had just completed his 3rd PhD. 3 doctorates by 25. The boy was, by every measurable standard, a genius. Jonathan Hartwell threw a celebration at their 5th Avenue penthouse, the kind of party where champagne flowed like water and every guest had either a Fortune 500 company or a university chair to their name. I served that night, moving through the crowd with trays of hors d'oeuvres, invisible as all good service should be. That's when I first noticed it. Benjamin stood in the corner of the grand living room, champagne glass untouched in his hand, while his father gave a toast. Jonathan's voice boomed across the room, proud, commanding, everything a Wall Street titan should be. He spoke of his son's achievements, of the Hartwell legacy, of brilliance that ran in the blood. Everyone applauded. Glasses clinked. And then someone, a colleague of Jonathan's, called out, "Speech! Let's hear from the genius himself." The room erupted in agreement. All eyes turned to Benjamin. I watched the color drain from his face. He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. He tried again. His jaw moved, but the words seemed trapped somewhere between his mind and his lips. Sweat appeared on his forehead, despite the cool temperature of the room. The silence stretched, uncomfortable, painful. Jonathan's smile never faltered, but I saw his jaw tighten. He stepped in smoothly, as he always did, filling the silence with a joke about how his son preferred equations to speeches, how the truly brilliant minds were too busy thinking to waste time talking. Everyone laughed. The moment passed, but I had seen Benjamin's eyes. I had seen the shame there, the terror. That was the first time, though it wouldn't be the last. Over the following months, I witnessed it again and again. Benjamin could discuss quantum entanglement for hours in a one-on-one conversation, his words flowing with passion and precision. But put him in front of any group, ask him to read aloud, and that brilliant mind would hit a wall. Jonathan didn't understand it. How could he? His son could calculate the probability curves of subatomic particles, but couldn't read a simple paragraph in front of his dissertation committee without freezing. It made no sense. So Jonathan did what Jonathan always did. He threw money at the problem. The first specialist arrived in February of 1985, Dr. Patricia Morrison, a speech therapist from Columbia Presbyterian, with a client list that read like a who's who of Manhattan's elite. She charged $800 an hour. I served tea during their sessions in the study. Dr. Morrison would have Benjamin practice breathing exercises, tongue placement, vocal warm-ups. Professional, clinical, expensive. After 3 months, there was no improvement. It's not a mechanical issue, Dr. Morrison finally admitted to Jonathan. I was in the room, clearing cups, unnoticed as always. His speech organs function perfectly. This is psychological. He needs a different kind of specialist. So came Dr. Raymond Chen, a psychiatrist who specialized in performance anxiety. $1,000 per session, twice a week. He talked to Benjamin about visualization, about reframing negative thoughts, about the neuroscience of fear response. 6 months, no change. Then came the hypnotherapist, the cognitive behavioral specialist, the neurologist who ran every test imaginable, producing scans and charts that showed nothing wrong with Benjamin's brain. If anything, his brain was extraordinary. I watched Jonathan's frustration grow with each failed attempt. He would sit in his home office late at night, whiskey in hand, staring at bills that totaled in the hundreds of thousands. But that wasn't what bothered him. Jonathan Hartwell hadn't become one of Wall Street's most successful traders by worrying about money. What bothered him was the failure, the not understanding. "I don't get it," he said to me one night. It was past midnight. I had brought him coffee, thinking he might need it. He looked up at me, and for once, the Titan looked lost. How can my son understand the fundamental building blocks of reality, but not read a grocery list out loud? Explain that to me. I couldn't. No one could. But what I learned, serving in that house, was that Jonathan's frustration came from a place deeper than confusion. It came from guilt, from the sense that somehow, despite giving his son every advantage money could buy, he had failed him. Benjamin, meanwhile, retreated further into himself. His academic work remained flawless. He published papers that other physicists called groundbreaking. He secured a junior professorship at the same university where he'd earned his degrees. But every lecture was torture, every presentation a nightmare. I heard from the university staff, the ones who cleaned and maintained the buildings, the ones who, like me, were invisible to most. They told me the stories, how Dr. Hartwell would stand at the podium, brilliant lecture notes in hand, and freeze, how students would shift uncomfortably in their seats, how some would snicker. The nickname spread. Dr. Stutter whispered in hallways, written in bathroom stalls. The cruel humor of youth that cuts deeper than any blade. Benjamin never complained, never spoke of it, but I saw it in the way he walked through the front door after each teaching day, shoulders slumped, eyes avoiding mine, the look of someone slowly drowning. Jonathan's response was to spend more, another specialist, another approach. By the summer of 1986, the total had exceeded $400,000. The study was filled with books on speech disorders, anxiety, trauma, neurology. A library of expensive knowledge that seemed to help nothing. What no one seemed to ask was the question that mattered most. Not, how do we fix this? But, where did this come from? I had my suspicions, small things I'd noticed. The way Benjamin would tense when anyone raised their voice, even in excitement. The way he avoided his father's study, where family photographs lined the walls, including several of Benjamin as a child. The way he never, ever spoke about his childhood. But it wasn't my place to ask. I was the help. I served. I observed. I kept my thoughts to myself until James Washington entered the picture. I first met James in the autumn of 1986, not at the Hartwell residence, but at the university where Benjamin taught. Jonathan had asked me to deliver some documents to his son, urgent papers that couldn't wait for the evening. I arrived at the physics building just after 5 in the afternoon. The halls were mostly empty, students and faculty having left for the day. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting everything in that peculiar institutional glow that makes every university corridor look the same. That's when I saw him. An older black man, maybe late 50s, pushing a cleaning cart down the hallway. He wore the standard university maintenance uniform, grey shirt and pants, and moved with the unhurried efficiency of someone who'd been doing this work for decades. What struck me wasn't his appearance, it was the way he moved through that space, not invisible, despite his role. There was a dignity to it, a presence. He looked up as I approached, and our eyes met. He nodded. A simple gesture, one service worker to another, an acknowledgement of kinship in the world of the unseen. "Looking for someone?" he asked. His voice was deep, warm, with the slight drawl of someone who'd grown up further south. "Dr. Hartwell's office," I replied. "End of the hall, left side. He's still in there, I think. Heard him earlier." He paused, studying me with eyes that seemed to see more than they should. "You're not university." "No, I work for his father." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, but a softening. "Ah, the butler." I must have looked surprised because he chuckled. "Dr. Hartwell talks sometimes, when he thinks no one's listening. Talks about his father, the house in Manhattan, the butler who's been with the family for years." He extended his hand. "James Washington." I shook it. His grip was firm, the hand calloused from years of labor. "Benjamin speaks about me?" I asked, curious. "Kindly," James said. "Says you're one of the few people in his life who doesn't expect anything from him, who just lets him be." He turned back to his cart, pulling out a spray bottle. "That's rare in his world, people who let you just be." I didn't know what to say to that, so I simply nodded and continued down the hall. But that brief encounter stayed with me. There was something about James Washington, a stillness, a sense that this was a man who paid attention, who saw things that others missed. I found Benjamin in his office, surrounded by papers covered in equations I couldn't begin to understand. He looked tired, more than tired, exhausted in a way that sleep couldn't fix. He took the documents from his father with a quiet "thank you," and I turned to leave. But something made me pause at the door. "Benjamin," I said, using his first name as I rarely did. He looked up, surprised. "Are you all right?" For a moment I thought he might actually answer honestly. His mouth opened, then closed. Then he simply nodded and turned back to his work. I left him there alone with his equations and his silence. The months that followed were the darkest I'd seen. Benjamin's teaching evaluations were suffering. Students complained that they couldn't understand him. Not because the material was difficult, but because his lectures were so painful to sit through. The department chair had started making pointed comments about tenure requirements and the importance of effective communication. Jonathan hired another specialist, then another. The bills kept coming. $500,000 became the new total. Nothing changed. It was March of 1987 when everything came to a head. Benjamin had been scheduled to present his latest research at a departmental symposium. Important work on quantum field theory that had the potential to shift how physicists understood particle interaction. His colleagues were excited. Even his father planned to attend. I wasn't there for the presentation itself, but I heard about it afterwards. From Jonathan, who came home that evening looking like he'd aged 10 years. from the university staff who whispered about it in the hallways, and later from Benjamin himself in the broken way he finally told me. He had frozen completely. Standing at the podium, in front of 50 of his peers, his research projected on the screen behind him, Benjamin had opened his mouth to speak and nothing had come out. Not a stutter, not a stumble, just silence. 10 seconds passed, 20, 30. Someone in the audience coughed. Another whispered something that made nearby seats erupt in muffled laughter. Benjamin's hands gripped the podium until his knuckles turned white. The department chair eventually stepped in, suggesting they take a brief recess. The room emptied. Benjamin remained at the podium, unable to move. By the time the recess ended, he was gone. Jonathan found me in the kitchen that evening, preparing dinner. His face was grey, his legendary composure shattered. "I don't know what to do," he said simply. "I don't know how to help my son." For the first time in 12 years of service, I broke protocol. I pulled out a chair at the kitchen table and sat down across from my employer. "Mr. Hartwell," I said quietly, "perhaps the question isn't how to help him. Perhaps it's why he needs help in the first place." Jonathan looked at me, uncomprehending. "Every specialist you've hired has tried to fix the symptom, the stuttering, the freezing, but none of them have asked where it comes from. What caused it?" "The neurologist said there's nothing physically wrong with him," Jonathan replied. "I didn't say it was physical." Silence stretched between us. Jonathan's hands wrapped around a coffee mug I'd placed in front of him, seeking warmth. "You think it's something from his past," he said finally. "I think," I said carefully, "that pain lives in us until we face it, and Benjamin is carrying something he's never faced." Jonathan stared into his coffee. "His mother and I divorced when he was 7. He lived with her mostly. I was building the firm, traveling constantly. I thought I was providing for him, giving him opportunities, but I wasn't there. Not really." He looked up at me, and I saw the guilt there, raw and bleeding. "What if I'm what broke him?" I had no answer for that, but I knew, sitting there in that kitchen, that money couldn't fix what Jonathan feared. No specialist could prescribe a cure for absence, for the fundamental question of whether a son had been seen and loved for who he was, rather than what he might become. Benjamin didn't come home that night, or the next. Jonathan called his apartment repeatedly. No answer. It was on the 3rd night that I received a call at the residence, a voice I recognized. "This is James Washington, from the university." "I remember," I said. "Dr. Hartwell is here in the building. I think he's been here since the symposium. Sleeping in his office, maybe. He won't talk to anyone, but he needs help." A pause. "I thought you might want to know." I found Jonathan in his study, staring at nothing. "Benjamin's at the university," I told him. "The janitor called, James Washington. He says Benjamin needs help." Jonathan was on his feet immediately. "I'm going." "Mr. Hartwell," I said, stopping him at the door. "Perhaps it's time to let someone else try." He turned, confused. "Someone who isn't family, who doesn't have $500,000 invested in fixing him. Someone who might just listen." Understanding dawned slowly. Jonathan nodded, though I could see it cost him. The great Jonathan Hartwell admitting he wasn't the solution. "Will you go?" he asked. "Yes, but I think I should wait. Give someone else a chance first." "Who?" I thought of James Washington, the dignity in his movements, the way he'd noticed things about Benjamin that others had missed, the simple statement that Benjamin needed someone who would let him just be. "The janitor," I said. Jonathan looked at me like I'd lost my mind, but he was desperate enough, tired enough, to simply nod. That's how I came to be standing outside the physics building at 9 o'clock on a March evening in 1987, watching through a window as James Washington found Benjamin Hartwell sitting on the floor of a hallway, back against the wall, knees pulled to his chest. I was far enough away that I couldn't hear the words, but I could see James approach slowly, not rushing, not hovering. He simply slid down the wall and sat next to Benjamin. 2 men on a cold floor, one in a suit that probably cost more than the other's monthly salary, the other in a grey maintenance uniform. They sat in silence for a long time, maybe 10 minutes, maybe more. I watched, hidden in the shadows across the quad, and waited. Then I saw James turn his head slightly, say something. Benjamin didn't respond at first. Then slowly, he began to talk. His shoulders shook. His hands moved, gesturing at nothing, and James just listened. An hour passed, then another. The building lights began shutting off, sections going dark as automatic timers kicked in. But the hallway where they sat remained lit, a small island of fluorescence in the gathering darkness. Eventually, I saw them stand. James put a hand on Benjamin's shoulder, a simple gesture. But Benjamin seemed to steady under it, to find something like ground beneath his feet. They walked together to the exit. I moved deeper into the shadows, letting them pass without seeing me. Benjamin's face was red, eyes swollen from crying. But there was something different in his posture, less crumpled, less defeated. James walked him to the parking lot, waited while Benjamin got in his car, and watched until he drove away. Only then did the old janitor turn, and somehow I wasn't surprised when his eyes found mine in the darkness. He walked over to where I stood. "He's going home," James said simply, "to his father's house. He'll arrive in about 40 minutes. He's going to need someone there." "What did you say to him?" I asked. James was quiet for a moment. I asked him a question, a simple question that nobody else thought to ask, which was, when was the first time you felt afraid to read out loud? The simplicity of it struck me. Not how do we fix this, not what's wrong with you, but when. When did this begin? When did the fear start? And what did he say? James looked up at the darkened building, at the windows of the physics department, where Benjamin had spent years trying to prove himself worthy of the accolades everyone heaped upon him. He told me about a second-grade classroom, a teacher named Mrs. Henderson, and the day his voice died. I waited, but James didn't elaborate. "The rest is his story to tell," the janitor said, "when he's ready. But I'll tell you this, what broke that boy wasn't complicated. It was simple and cruel, the way these things often are. And what he needs to heal isn't more therapy or techniques. He needs to go back to that moment and see it differently, see himself differently. Can you help him do that?" I asked. James smiled, a sad sort of smile. "I can ask questions, I can listen, but the healing, that's his work. I just hold the space for it." He turned to leave, pushing his cleaning cart that he'd left by the building entrance. "Mr. Washington," I called after him. He stopped. "Thank you." He nodded once and continued on his way, disappearing into the March night, leaving me with more questions than answers, but for the first time in years, something that felt like hope. I drove back to the Hartwell residence and found Jonathan exactly where I'd left him, in his study, waiting. "He's coming home," I told him. "He'll be here soon." Relief flooded Jonathan's face. "Did you talk to him?" "No, but someone else did." "The janitor?" I nodded. "And what did he do? What technique did he use?" I thought about James sitting on that floor, just being present, just listening. About the simple question that opened a door every expensive specialist had failed to find. "He asked Benjamin when it started," I said, "not how to fix it when it began." Jonathan stared at me. "That's it? That's what I spent $500,000 trying to find. And a janitor just asked when." "Sometimes," I said quietly, "the most important questions are the simplest ones. We just need someone who cares enough to ask them." We heard Benjamin's car in the driveway 20 minutes later. Jonathan stood, clearly wanting to rush to the door, but I put a hand on his arm. "Let him come to you," I said. "And when he does, just listen. Don't try to fix it, don't offer solutions, just listen." It was perhaps the hardest thing I'd ever asked of Jonathan Hartwell. To do nothing, to simply be present for his son without agenda or solution. But he did it. Benjamin came through the front door, saw his father standing in the study doorway, and for a long moment, they just looked at each other. Then Benjamin's face crumpled, and he fell into his father's arms like a child, sobbing with the kind of grief that comes from years of carrying something too heavy alone. Jonathan held him, said nothing, just held him while his son cried. I retreated to give them privacy, but I could hear Benjamin's voice, broken and raw, telling his father something he'd held inside for 20 years. about being 7 years old in Mrs. Henderson's second grade class, about being called to the front of the room to read aloud from a book, about stumbling over a word, pronouncing it wrong, trying again, and getting it wrong again, about Mrs. Henderson's exasperated sigh, her cutting remark, "If you can't read simple English, Benjamin, perhaps you should go back to kindergarten." The class had laughed. Not mean laughter, perhaps, just children being children. But to a 7-year-old boy, it was devastating. And then it happened, the thing that turned embarrassment into trauma. He'd felt it coming, that terrible pressure, but there was no time. He wet himself, standing there at the front of the class, the warm shame spreading down his legs. The laughter turning to horrified giggles, Mrs. Henderson's disgusted face. He ran from the room, locked himself in a bathroom stall, and something in him decided, in that moment, that reading aloud was dangerous, that his voice was dangerous, that being seen was dangerous. From that day forward, whenever he had to read in front of others, his body remembered. The fear returned, the shame, and his voice, trying to protect him from experiencing that humiliation again, simply shut down. For 20 years he'd carried that, through middle school where he'd learned to fake illness on presentation days, through high school where he'd chosen written reports over oral ones, through college where he'd picked courses carefully to avoid public speaking, through 3 PhD programs where brilliant written work compensated for disastrous defenses. All because no one had ever asked him when it started. No one had helped him see that moment for what it really was, not a defining truth about who he was, but simply a bad day, a cruel moment, not a life sentence. That night, sitting in his father's study, Benjamin told the story out loud for the first time. And in the telling, something shifted, not fixed, not healed, but cracked open, letting light touch a wound that had festered in darkness for 2 decades. Jonathan listened. And when Benjamin finished, when the words finally ran out, his father said something I'll never forget. "I'm so sorry I wasn't there. I'm sorry I didn't know. I'm sorry I spent 3 years trying to fix you when you were never broken. You were just hurt, and no one saw it." Benjamin cried again, but differently this time, not the desperate sobs of shame, but the cleansing tears of being truly seen. I don't know what time they finally went to bed that night. I left them in the study, father and son, beginning the real work of understanding each other, the work that money can't buy and specialists can't prescribe. The next morning, Benjamin called James Washington. I know because Benjamin asked me for his number, which I'd gotten the night before, thinking it might be needed. What they discussed, I don't know. But that afternoon, Benjamin asked his father for something unusual. "I want to meet with James again," he said. "Not here. At the university. And I want to do it regularly, not therapy, just conversation. Is that okay?" Jonathan, who'd spent $500,000 on specialists, simply nodded. "Whatever you need." And so began an unlikely friendship, a 30-year-old quantum physicist and a 58-year-old janitor meeting twice a week in an empty classroom after hours. I learned about their conversations only in pieces, from things Benjamin would mention to his father, from the gradual changes I witnessed. James didn't use techniques. He didn't have fancy degrees or therapeutic frameworks. What he had was something that turned out to be far more valuable. He had lived a life rich in pain and wisdom, had faced his own demons and emerged not unscathed but whole, and he knew how to ask questions that mattered. Questions like, what would you tell that 7-year-old boy now if you could? And do you think the teacher's cruelty said more about you or about her? And what if that moment doesn't define you? What if it was just something that happened and you get to decide what it means? Simple questions. But they required Benjamin to look at his story differently, to step outside the shame and see it from another angle. The change wasn't immediate. Healing never is. But week by week, something in Benjamin began to shift. He started volunteering answers in departmental meetings, started accepting invitations to speak at small faculty gatherings, started slowly reclaiming his voice. But the real transformation, the moment I knew something fundamental had broken open, came on a rainy April afternoon, 6 weeks after that first conversation with James. Benjamin had asked James to meet him at the university soccer field, an odd location, but James agreed. I drove Benjamin there, and he asked me to stay, to witness what he was about to do. We stood at the edge of the field, rain falling steadily, soaking through our clothes. James arrived shortly after, umbrella in hand, looking curious. Benjamin walked to the center of the field, rain streaming down his face, mixing with what might have been tears. James and I watched from the sideline, uncertain what we were about to witness. He stood there for a long moment, face tilted toward the gray sky, arms at his sides. Then he turned back to us. "James asked me something yesterday," Benjamin called out, his voice carrying across the empty field. "He asked me what I would say to that 7-year-old boy if I could go back, if I could stand in that classroom and speak to him before it all went wrong." The rain fell harder. Benjamin didn't seem to notice. "I've been thinking about it all night. And I realized I can't go back. I can't change what happened, but I can tell that boy something now, something he needed to hear then, something I need to hear now." He closed his eyes, took a breath, and then Benjamin Hartwell did something he hadn't done in 20 years. He screamed, not words, just sound, raw, primal, a release of everything he'd been holding inside since he was 7 years old. The shame, the fear, the silence that had choked him for 2 decades. It poured out of him in a sound that echoed across the empty field, absorbed by the rain and the open sky. He screamed until his voice broke, until his knees buckled, until he fell forward onto the wet grass, hands pressed into the mud, sobbing. James moved first. He walked across the field with that same unhurried dignity, knelt beside Benjamin in the mud, and put a hand on his back. Said nothing, just stayed there, solid and present, while Benjamin cried out 20 years of pain. I stood watching, rain soaking through my clothes, and I understood. This wasn't therapy, this wasn't a technique. This was a man reclaiming something that had been stolen from him. His voice, his right to be heard, his right to make mistakes and still be worthy. After what felt like an eternity, Benjamin's sobs quieted. He sat back on his heels, looked up at James through the rain, and something passed between them. Recognition, gratitude, the wordless acknowledgement of a gift that can never be repaid. James helped him to his feet. They walked back across the field together, muddy and soaked, and Benjamin looked different. Not fixed, not cured, but unburdened in a way I'd never seen him. We drove home in silence. Benjamin stared out the window at the rain-slicked streets of New York, and I let him be. Whatever had happened on that field, whatever door had opened, he needed time to walk through it. When we arrived at the residence, Jonathan was waiting in the foyer. He took one look at his son, covered in mud, eyes red from crying but somehow clearer than they'd been in years, and he simply opened his arms. Benjamin walked into his father's embrace, and Jonathan held him like he should have been holding him all along, not as a trophy, not as a legacy, just as his son. The weeks that followed were unlike anything I'd witnessed in 12 years with the Hartwell family. Benjamin continued meeting with James twice a week, but something had fundamentally shifted. The conversations were no longer about the trauma, about understanding what had happened. They were about moving forward, about building something new on the foundation of that understanding. Benjamin started small. He volunteered to read announcements at faculty meetings, just a few sentences. His voice would shake, sometimes stumble, but he pushed through. And each time he did, the fear had a little less power over him. His colleagues noticed, not because he was suddenly perfect, but because he was trying. The whispers of Dr. Stutter began to fade, replaced by something like respect for a man facing his demons in public. It was late May when the department chair approached Benjamin with an opportunity. A small conference, just 50 attendees, focused on emerging theories in quantum field research. They wanted Benjamin to present his work. 20 minutes, questions afterward. Benjamin's first instinct was to refuse. I saw it in his face when he told his father about it over dinner. The old fear rising up like muscle memory. But Jonathan, who had learned something about listening in the past 2 months, simply asked, "What do you want to do?" Not what should you do. Not what would be best for your career. Just what do you want? Benjamin was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I want to try, but I need help." The next day, he asked James if they could practice, not with breathing exercises or visualization techniques, but with something simpler. He wanted to read his presentation out loud to someone who wouldn't judge, who wouldn't expect perfection, who would just let him stumble through it and try again. They met in that empty classroom after hours. I know because Benjamin told me about it later, his voice filled with something I hadn't heard before. Not pride exactly, something gentler. Self-compassion maybe. He said he read the presentation 17 times that week. The first time, he made it through 3 sentences before freezing. James just nodded and said, "Again." By the 17th time, he read the entire 20 minutes with only a handful of stumbles. Not perfect, but real. And James told him something that changed how Benjamin saw the whole thing. "Perfection isn't the goal," James said. "Connection is. Those people aren't coming to watch you perform. They're coming to learn about your work, to understand something they didn't understand before. If you stumble over a word, so what? You're still teaching them something valuable. You're still sharing something that matters." It was such a simple reframe, but it moved Benjamin from seeing the presentation as a test he might fail to seeing it as a gift he was offering. The stumbles weren't failures. They were just part of being human. The conference was scheduled for the first week of June. Benjamin spent the days leading up to it in a state of controlled anxiety, not panic, but the kind of nervous energy that comes before anything important. Normal fear, the kind everyone feels. Jonathan asked if Benjamin wanted him there. Benjamin thought about it and said no, not because he didn't want his father's support, but because he needed to do this for himself, to prove to himself that he could. But he did ask James to come, and he asked me. So on a Tuesday morning in early June 1987, James Washington and I sat in the back row of a university conference room, 2 service workers in a sea of academics, watching Benjamin Hartwell prepare to reclaim his voice. The room filled slowly. Physicists from various universities, some I recognized from previous Hartwell gatherings, others unfamiliar. They chatted with each other, drinking coffee, flipping through the conference program. Casual, comfortable in this space in a way Benjamin had never been. Benjamin sat in the front row, his presentation notes in his lap. I could see his hands shaking slightly, could see him taking slow, deliberate breaths. But he didn't run, didn't flee to the bathroom and hide. He stayed. The conference organizer, a pleasant woman in her 50s, stepped to the podium and welcomed everyone, made a few introductory remarks, then introduced Benjamin. "Dr. Hartwell's work on quantum field interaction has been making waves in our community. We're fortunate to have him here today to present his latest findings. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Benjamin Hartwell." Polite applause. Benjamin stood, walked to the podium, set his notes down, looked out at the 50 faces watching him, and froze. I felt my heart sink. Beside me, James leaned forward slightly, hands clasped between his knees, watching intently, but without anxiety, as if he knew something I didn't. 10 seconds passed, 15. I could see Benjamin's jaw working, trying to force words that wouldn't come, could see the old panic rising in his eyes. But then something happened, something I'll remember for the rest of my life. Benjamin's eyes found James in the back row, held there for just a moment. And I saw James do something so subtle most people probably missed it. He simply nodded, a tiny gesture that said, "I see you. You're okay. Try again." Benjamin took a breath, then another, and he made a choice. Instead of fighting the fear, instead of trying to pretend it wasn't there, he acknowledged it. "I apologize," he said, and his voice cracked on the words, but they came out. I have a speech impediment. Sometimes I freeze when I have to speak publicly. It might happen again during this presentation. If it does, I'll need a moment, and then I'll continue. I hope that's all right." The room was silent, but it was a different kind of silence than before. Not uncomfortable, not mocking, just accepting. Someone in the third row, a woman with grey hair and kind eyes, smiled and said, "Take all the time you need, Dr. Hartwell. We're here for your ideas, not your performance." And just like that, the pressure released, because Benjamin had done something he'd never done before. He'd told the truth. He'd shown his vulnerability. And instead of being destroyed by it, he'd been met with understanding. He began his presentation. Was it smooth? No. He stumbled over words, paused, sometimes mid-sentence, to gather himself. At one point, about 10 minutes in, he froze completely, just as he'd warned. For 30 seconds he stood there, unable to speak, but instead of panicking, instead of running, he simply closed his eyes, breathed, found his place in his notes, and continued. And here's what I noticed. The audience leaned in. They listened not despite his struggles, but because of the courage it clearly took. They asked questions afterward that showed they'd absorbed every word, every equation, every implication of his research. When it was over, when Benjamin returned to his seat, the applause was genuine, not polite, earned. A few people approached him afterward, colleagues wanting to discuss his findings. One older professor shook his hand and said, "That took guts, son. The work is brilliant, but the courage to present it like that's rarer than genius." Benjamin's eyes were bright with unshed tears when he looked back at James and me, but this time they were tears of something other than shame, relief, pride, the complicated joy of doing something terrifying and surviving it. We took him out for lunch afterward, James and I. A small diner near campus where professors and maintenance workers ate side by side without much thought to the hierarchy that divided them everywhere else. We sat in a corner booth, and for the first time since I'd known him, Benjamin looked at ease. "Thank you," he said to James, the words simple but weighted with everything unspoken. James shook his head. "I didn't do anything. You did the work. I just asked questions." "You asked the right questions," Benjamin replied. "The ones no one else thought to ask, the ones that mattered." James was quiet for a moment, looking down at his coffee. Then he said something that I sensed was important, though I didn't understand why at the time. "Someone asked me the right questions once too, long time ago, when I needed them. That's the only reason I knew what to ask you." Benjamin studied the older man. "Who?" James smiled, but it was tinged with old sadness. "My daughter. Back when I thought I'd lost everything. She was 16, and she asked me when I'd stopped believing I deserved to be happy. Simple question. Changed my life." "I didn't know you had a daughter," Benjamin said. "I don't talk about her much. She passed away 10 years ago now. Cancer." James's voice was steady, but I could hear the grief underneath, the kind that never fully leaves. "But before she died, she taught me more about living than anyone else ever has. About facing pain instead of hiding from it. About finding meaning in the struggle." The booth was silent, except for the clatter of dishes and conversation from other tables. Benjamin reached across and put his hand on James's arm. "I'm sorry," he said simply. James nodded, accepting the condolence. "Me too, but I learned something from losing her, that the people who matter most aren't always the ones with the degrees or the money or the prestige. They're the ones who see you, really see you, and help you see yourself." He looked up at Benjamin. "You've got a gift, son, not just for physics, for honesty, for courage. Don't waste it trying to be perfect. Spend it being real." We finished our meal in companionable silence. Three men from vastly different worlds who'd been brought together by pain and possibility. And I thought about what James had said, about being seen, about asking the right questions. How much suffering could be prevented, I wondered, if we all learned to ask not, "How do I fix you?" but "When did you start believing you were broken?" The summer passed in a kind of gentle transformation. Benjamin continued teaching, continued presenting his research. He wasn't cured. There were still bad days, still moments when his voice failed him, but he'd learned to work with it rather than against it, to pause when he needed to acknowledge the difficulty and move through it anyway. His relationship with his father deepened in ways I don't think either of them expected. Jonathan began asking Benjamin about his work, not with the agenda of a parent measuring success, but with genuine curiosity. And Benjamin began telling him, sharing not just the achievements, but the struggles, the failures that led to breakthroughs, the questions he couldn't yet answer. They became, slowly, not just father and son, but two men who respected each other. It was late August when something unexpected happened. Benjamin came home one evening with news. The university had offered him a promotion, full professorship, tenure, recognition not just of his research, but of his teaching, which had, against all odds, become something his students valued. Jonathan was thrilled, broke out a bottle of champagne he'd been saving. We toasted in the study, the three of us, Benjamin, his father, and me, the butler who'd watched this family struggle and heal. "We should celebrate properly," Jonathan said. "Dinner at Le Cirque, my treat. Invite James too. He should be part of this." Benjamin smiled. "I'll ask him tomorrow." But tomorrow brought something none of us expected. Benjamin called the residents from the university, his voice strange, shaken in a way I hadn't heard since March. "Is my father there?" he asked when I answered. "In his study." "What's wrong?" "I need to speak with him. Both of you. Can you come to the university?" "Now?" 20 minutes later, Jonathan and I walked into the physics building to find Benjamin standing in the hallway outside James's maintenance closet. His face was pale. "What's going on?" Jonathan asked. Benjamin gestured to a bulletin board on the wall. Faculty announcements, maintenance schedules, and there, partially obscured by other notices, an old newspaper clipping, yellowed with age. I stepped closer to read it. The headline made my breath catch. "Local physicist wins MacArthur Genius Grant." The photo showed a younger James Washington, maybe 40 years old, standing in what looked like a laboratory. The article, dated 1974, detailed his groundbreaking work in thermodynamics. Contributions that had advanced the field significantly. Predictions that he would be a major voice in physics for decades to come. "I don't understand," Jonathan said, reading over my shoulder. "I found it by accident," Benjamin said quietly. "I was looking for James to tell him about the promotion. His closet was open. This was pinned to the inside of the door, hidden, and when I asked him about it, we turned to see James standing at the end of the hallway, cleaning cart beside him. He'd clearly heard us. His face was calm, but I could see resignation there, the look of someone whose secret has been exposed. "You're a physicist," Benjamin said, and it wasn't quite a question. "You were brilliant. You won a MacArthur grant, and you're working as a janitor." James walked toward us slowly. When he reached us, he gently took down the newspaper clipping, folding it carefully. "That was a long time ago," he said simply. "What happened?" Benjamin asked. James looked at the three of us. Then he sighed, the sound of someone who'd carried something heavy for too long. "Can we sit?" he asked. "This isn't a hallway story." We found an empty classroom. James sat on the edge of the desk, and we took seats in the student chairs, waiting. "I was a physicist," James began. "A good one. Loved the work, had a position at Columbia, a research lab, graduate students. I was on track for tenure. Everything was going well." He paused, the memory clearly painful. "Then my wife got sick, breast cancer, 1976. We had a daughter, Michelle, just 8 years old. My wife needed treatment, needed care. The medical bills were staggering, even with insurance. I took a leave from the university to be with her. Thought I'd go back after she recovered." His voice dropped. "She didn't recover. She died in 78, and I fell apart, stopped going to work, stopped doing research. Spent 2 years just trying to figure out how to be a father to a grieving child while I was drowning myself." The classroom was silent. Even the sounds from the hallway seemed muted. By the time I pulled myself together enough to try to return to physics, my position at Columbia was gone. My research was outdated. The field had moved on, and I had a daughter to support, bills to pay. So I took a job in maintenance at the university. Familiar place, steady paycheck, benefits. But your work, Benjamin said, your research, it was brilliant. James smiled sadly. Brilliance doesn't pay the rent, son, and it doesn't fill the hole left by losing someone you love. I thought about going back, trying to reclaim that life. But then I realized something, that life had cost me everything that mattered. I was so focused on the next grant, the next paper, the next breakthrough, that I missed my daughter growing up. Missed time with my wife before she got sick. I chose prestige over presence. He looked at Benjamin directly. And when I lost them, when I lost my wife and then years later my daughter too, I understood. The work I did as a physicist might have been important to science, but the work I do now, the conversations I have, the people I meet, that's important to life, to living. And I'd rather be a janitor who knows how to live than a brilliant physicist who forgot how. The weight of that statement settled over us. Jonathan, who'd spent his entire life chasing success, winning in business, building an empire, looked shaken. You gave it all up, he said. I lost some things, James corrected gently, but I found others, peace, purpose, the ability to sleep at night knowing I hadn't missed what mattered, chasing what didn't. Benjamin was crying quietly. You could have told me when we first started talking. And what would you have thought? James asked. That I was some failed physicist trying to live vicariously through you, that my advice came from bitterness about my own lost career. He shook his head. I didn't help you because I used to be a physicist. I helped you because I'm a person who learned the hard way that the things we run from are usually the things we most need to face. He stood, picking up the newspaper clipping. This man, he said, gesturing to the photo, was brilliant, but he was also broken and didn't know it. The man I am now, he's just a janitor, but he's whole, and I'll take whole over brilliant any day. The revelation changed something between them. Not the friendship, but the understanding of it. Benjamin had thought he was being helped by a simple janitor with folk wisdom. Instead, he'd been guided by someone who'd walked the path of academic success and found it wanting. Someone who'd chosen a different kind of life deliberately. They continued meeting, but the conversations shifted. Now they talked not just about Benjamin's healing, but about what kind of life he wanted to build, what success actually meant to him. Whether the path everyone expected him to walk was the path he wanted to take. And Benjamin started making different choices. He accepted the full professorship, but he also cut his course load to spend more time actually living. He started saying no to conferences that didn't interest him, even if they were prestigious. He began teaching an undergraduate course for non-majors just because he enjoyed making complex ideas accessible to people who'd never think about physics otherwise. His father watched these changes with mixed feelings, pride that his son was finding his way, but also confusion about why Benjamin seemed to be choosing less rather than more. It was late September when Jonathan finally asked me about it. We were in his study, evening settling over Manhattan, the city lights beginning to sparkle outside the windows. I don't understand him anymore, Jonathan admitted. He could be running a research lab, could be publishing groundbreaking papers, could be winning awards. Instead, he's teaching freshman physics and going home at 5 to read novels. Is that what I spent $500,000 for? I poured him a scotch, thinking about how to answer. Mr. Hartwell, I said carefully, what did you want for Benjamin? Really want, beneath all the expectations. Jonathan stared into his glass. I wanted him to be happy, to be successful. And do you think he's happy now? Silence stretched. Then Jonathan nodded slowly. Yes. For the first time in years, I think he actually is. Then perhaps, I suggested, the $500,000 didn't buy what you thought you were buying. It bought you both the crisis that led you here, to this understanding, to him being happy. That seems like money well spent. Jonathan looked up at me, surprise in his eyes. Then he laughed, sharp and bitter, and somehow relieved all at once. You're telling me I had to waste $500,000 to learn to listen to my son? "I'm telling you," I said, "that sometimes the most expensive lessons are the most valuable, not because of what we buy, but because of what we learn we couldn't buy." He drank his scotch, sat with that, then said quietly, "James could have told me that, could have told me who he was, what he'd learned. Maybe I would have listened sooner." "Would you have?" I asked. "If a janitor had tried to tell you 3 years ago that your son didn't need expensive specialists, would you have believed him? Or would it have taken him revealing he was once a MacArthur Fellow for you to take him seriously?" Jonathan winced. The truth landed hard. "We hear wisdom based on who delivers it," I continued, "not on whether it's true. James knew that. That's why he stayed quiet about his past. He let his words speak for themselves, not his credentials." "Smart man," Jonathan murmured. "Very smart," I agreed. Smart enough to know that the most important work he could do wasn't in a laboratory. It was in conversations, in questions, in being present for people who needed someone to see them. We sat in companionable silence, two men who'd both learned something about what mattered from watching Benjamin Hartwell fall apart and piece himself back together. The autumn semester passed. Benjamin thrived in a quiet way that didn't make headlines but filled his days with satisfaction. His students loved him, not because he was a brilliant lecturer, though he was, but because he was genuine. He told them about his struggles, about the fact that he still sometimes froze mid-sentence, about how he'd learned that persistence mattered more than perfection, and his honesty gave them permission to be honest too, about their own fears, their own struggles. The classroom became a space where vulnerability was strength, where admitting you didn't understand was the first step toward understanding. It was November when Benjamin did something that surprised everyone. He submitted a paper to a major physics journal, but it wasn't about quantum field theory. It was about physics education, about how we teach, about creating space for students who don't fit the traditional mold of academic success, about recognizing that brilliance comes in many forms, and that the barriers we place in front of students often say more about our limitations than theirs. The paper was deeply personal. He wrote about his own experience, about freezing in front of his dissertation committee, about being called Dr. Stutter, about almost losing his career because of a childhood trauma no one had thought to address. And he wrote about James, not by name but by impact, about what it meant to have someone ask the right questions, to be seen not as a problem to fix, but as a person who'd been hurt and needed space to heal. The paper was published in January of 1988. It created a stir, not a huge one, but enough. Other academics reached out, sharing their own stories of hidden struggles. Students wrote to say they'd felt seen. A few universities began rethinking how they supported students with learning differences or anxiety or trauma. Benjamin's work in physics was brilliant, but this paper, this vulnerable sharing of his pain and healing, it mattered in a different way. It changed how people thought about what it meant to be smart, to be successful, to be worthy of respect. And it all traced back to a simple question asked by a janitor on a hallway floor. "When did you first feel afraid to read out loud?" Winter came to New York. The semester ended. Benjamin spent Christmas with his father, and for the first time in years, their conversation was easy. Not perfect. Families are never perfect, but honest, connected, real. James came to Christmas dinner that year. It was Benjamin's idea, and Jonathan agreed immediately. We sat around the table, an odd collection, a Wall Street titan, a quantum physicist, a janitor who used to be a physicist, and me, the butler who'd watched it all unfold. Over roasted duck and wine that cost more than most people's monthly rent, we talked about everything except money and prestige and success as the world measures it. We talked about books we'd read, memories that made us laugh, people we missed. The kind of conversation that happens when everyone at the table has learned that being known matters more than being impressive. At one point, Jonathan raised his glass. "To James," he said simply, "for asking the question that changed everything." We drank to that, but James shook his head. "I didn't change anything," he said. "Benjamin did the work. I just held up a mirror." "Sometimes," Benjamin replied, "that's exactly what people need. Someone to hold up a mirror so they can see themselves clearly for the first time." The months turned into years. Benjamin continued teaching, continued his research, but at a pace that left room for life. He dated, though nothing serious stuck. Traveled, not to conferences, but to places he'd always wanted to see. Built a life that felt like his, rather than like the life everyone expected him to live. James continued working as a janitor. He could have returned to physics. Benjamin and Jonathan both offered to help make connections, but he declined. He was content where he was, useful, present, at peace with the path his life had taken. And I continued serving the Hartwell family, watching them with the satisfaction of someone who'd witnessed something rare, a healing, a transformation that money couldn't buy, but somehow made all that money meaningful. It's been years now since that rainy April afternoon when Benjamin screamed in an empty field. I'm older. So is James. So is Benjamin, though he's still young in the way that matters, still curious about the world, still asking questions. Jonathan passed away 2 years ago. Heart attack in his office, quick and clean. Benjamin inherited everything, of course. The fortune, the company, the Fifth Avenue penthouse. He sold the company, donated most of the money to scholarships for students from disadvantaged backgrounds, kept enough to live comfortably and fund his research, moved out of the penthouse to a smaller place in Brooklyn, where he could hear the neighborhood around him, feel part of something larger than himself, and he hired James as a consultant. Not for physics, for life. They meet once a week still, two old friends talking about what matters. I'm retired now, living comfortably on the generous pension Jonathan left me. But I still see Benjamin sometimes. He visits, brings coffee, and we talk about his father, about James, about that strange season when everything fell apart and came back together differently. He asked me once what I learned from all of it, from watching him struggle and heal. From witnessing the $500,000 that failed and the $12 an hour janitor who succeeded, I told him the truth. I learned that the most expensive thing in the world is a question left unasked, that we spend fortunes trying to fix symptoms while ignoring causes. That wisdom isn't about credentials or achievements, it's about paying attention, asking the right questions, being willing to sit with someone in their pain without trying to rush them out of it. "And what's the right question?" he asked, smiling because he already knew. "Not how do I fix this," I said, "but when did this begin? Not what's wrong with you, but what happened to you. Not how can I make you better, but how can I help you see yourself clearly?" Benjamin nodded, the gesture so reminiscent of James it made me smile. "James taught me that," he said, "that the answer is usually hiding in the story we're afraid to tell. We just need someone brave enough to ask us to tell it." We sat in silence then, comfortable the way old friends can be, and I thought about all the people I'd served over 40 years, the wealthy, the powerful, the brilliant, and I realized that the greatest privilege of my life hadn't been serving them. It had been witnessing this. Watching three men from completely different worlds find each other in their brokenness and build something whole. Watching money fail where compassion succeeded. Watching credentials fall short where humanity prevailed. That's the story I want to leave with you. Not just Benjamin's story, though it's remarkable, but the larger truth it points to. We live in a world that worships solutions, quick fixes, expert advice, the right technique, the right prescription, the right 5-step program. We throw money at problems. We buy our way out of discomfort. We hire specialists to tell us how to fix what's broken. And sometimes that works. Sometimes the specialist has the answer. Sometimes money buys what we need, but not always. Sometimes what we need can't be bought. Sometimes the solution isn't in a technique or a prescription or a program. Sometimes it's in a question. A simple question asked by someone who cares enough to listen to the answer. When did you first feel afraid? What happened to you? Who taught you that you weren't enough? Where does this pain come from? These questions cost nothing. They require no credentials, no degrees, no expensive training. They just require presence, attention, the willingness to sit with someone in their story and help them see it differently. That's what James gave Benjamin. Not therapy, not treatment, just presence. The space to tell his story, the courage to ask when it began, the wisdom to know that understanding the wound is the first step toward healing it. And that's what I learned serving the Hartwell family, that the most valuable thing we can offer each other isn't advice or answers or solutions. It's witness, the willingness to see someone fully, pain and all, and say, I see you. Your story matters. You're not alone in this. Jonathan Hartwell spent $500,000 trying to fix his son, and every penny failed, not because the specialists weren't good at what they did, but because they were trying to fix a symptom without understanding the cause. They were treating the stutter without asking about the shame. They were focused on the voice without understanding what had silenced it. James Washington, earning $12 an hour to clean bathrooms, succeeded where they failed. Not because he was smarter, not because he had better techniques, but because he asked a different question, a simpler question, a question that got to the heart of the matter. When did this begin? 4 words that opened a door to 20 years of locked-away pain. 4 words that cost nothing and meant everything. That's the lesson. That's what I carry with me from that rainy April afternoon when I watched Benjamin Hartwell scream himself free. Money can buy comfort, it can buy education, it can buy expertise, but it can't buy understanding, it can't buy presence. It can't buy the kind of wisdom that comes from having walked through fire yourself and emerged knowing that the point isn't to avoid getting burned, it's to learn to carry the scars with grace. James carried his scars with grace. He'd lost his wife, lost his daughter, lost his career, and from those losses, he'd learned something that made him more valuable to Benjamin than all the specialists Jonathan could hire. He'd learned that being seen matters more than being fixed, that asking the right question matters more than having the right answer, that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do for someone is simply sit with them in their pain and ask, where does this hurt? When did it start? What do you need? Simple questions, profound impact. I think about that often now. In my retirement, I watch the world rush past, everyone searching for the next solution, the next expert, the next technique that will make everything better. And I want to tell them what I learned. Slow down, pay attention, ask questions, listen to the answers, be present for the people in front of you. That's where healing lives. Not in the expensive specialist's office, not in the cutting-edge treatment, not in the 5-step program or the miracle cure. It lives in the space between 2 people when one asks a simple question with genuine care and the other finally feels safe enough to answer. Benjamin Hartwell had 3 PhDs, but read like a 7-year-old until a black janitor asked one question that healed him. The question wasn't complicated. The healing wasn't instant. The work wasn't easy, but it was real, and it was possible. And it cost nothing except the courage to ask and the willingness to listen. That's the story. That's the lesson. And if you've stayed with me this long, if you've listened to this old butler ramble about a family he served and a healing he witnessed, then maybe you understand what I'm really asking. What questions have you left unasked? What pain have you been trying to fix without understanding where it comes from? What would happen if you stopped trying to solve everything and simply asked, when did this begin? Maybe you need to ask yourself. Maybe you need to ask someone you love. Maybe you need to create space for someone to ask you. But ask, listen, be present. That's where the healing lives. That's where transformation begins. Not in the expensive solution, not in the expert advice, but in the simple question asked with genuine care. If this story moved you, I need to ask you something. In the comments below, tell me this. Have you ever been like Benjamin, carrying pain from so long ago you forgot where it started? Or like Jonathan, trying to fix something without understanding it? Or like James, learning wisdom from loss? Your story matters. Share it with us. Someone needs to hear it. Someone needs to know they're not alone. And if you know someone who needs to hear this story, someone who's been trying to fix themselves, or someone they love without asking the right questions, share this with them. Sometimes the stories that change us are the ones we pass along. Because here's what I've learned in 40 years of service, in 4 decades of standing in corners and watching the wealthy struggle with the same pain as everyone else. We're all carrying something. We're all broken in some way, and we all need someone to ask us the right question at the right time. Be that person for someone. Ask the question, listen to the answer, hold space for the healing. That's how we change the world, not with money or expertise or solutions, but with presence. With questions, with the willingness to witness each other's pain and say, I see you. Your story matters. You're not alone. Until next time, remember this. True wealth isn't measured in what we own or what we achieve. It's measured in the questions we ask, the presence we offer, and the space we hold for others to become whole. Thank you for listening to this old butler's story. May you find the courage to ask the questions that matter. May you find the wisdom to listen to the answers. And may you find the people who see you clearly and love you anyway. That's what matters. That's what heals. That's what changes everything. The rest is just noise.